This series contains real stories from a poisoning outbreak, told from the perspective of an investigation unfolding in real time as we search for clues and answers. It includes severe illness and death. Some moments may be difficult to hear. The views and opinions expressed on this series represent the people speaking them, and not any organization they are affiliated with. This podcast discusses medical and food safety topics, but it is for education and storytelling only. It is not medical advice and makes no claims about the safety of any food. If you are concerned about a possible poisoning or the safety of any food, contact your local poison center for free personalized medical advice. In the U.S., that number is 1-800-222-1222.
6 people are now dead. Authorities say poisoned Tylenol capsules reached store shelves.
Dozens became ill after drinking coffee investigators believe was deliberately poisoned.
Health officials are tracking a cluster of lead poisonings linked to a popular fruit pouch sold for children. Investigators suggest the contamination may have been intentional.
A train carrying hazardous chemicals derailed overnight, forcing thousands from their homes.
Officials believe a toxic ingredient may be behind illnesses at a restaurant. Investigators are focused on a spice that should never have been in food. Experts say even a tiny amount can be fatal.
Several deaths are now being reviewed.
More than 50 people have reported symptoms. State health officials are now working to find the source.
The company is offering a $100,000 reward for information on who may have added the poison.
Authorities are calling it a poisoning.
A mass poisoning.
Another outbreak.
A poisoning outbreak.
An outbreak.
An outbreak.
An outbreak.
A mass poisoning outbreak.
Hey everyone, it's Ryan with a quick note before we dive in. In this episode, we are going to put a mushroom on trial. And the tool we use to do that is one of the most important frameworks in public health, the Bradford Hill criteria. Now, in previous versions of this episode and others, I went into great detail on what the framework is and how we use it to think about causation when trying to associate a never-before-seen exposure with a disease. I love getting to educate people about these topics. It's always so hard for me to strike the balance between the depth I'd like to go into in terms of detail and the true level of engagement the general audience will have. So I have been informed that only the incredibly cool, or maybe just super nerdy people, want the full nuts and bolts breakdown of how we use this causation schema in mass poisonings. So I pulled it out. But if that is your thing, well, I'm here for you. And there's actually a full extended episode where our conversation is much longer and we walk through the entire Bradford Hill criteria, how they've been used in past outbreaks like in Mount Siobhan or Ivali, and how we applied them here in this outbreak to stress tests whether morels are actually the cause or if there were any large holes in the argument that needed to be explored. That process is what shaped the conversation you're about to hear in this episode. So this is a streamlined version. You're still getting the most important parts. But if you want to hear the full deep dive and learn more about the Bradford Hill criteria, it's there for you. But I'd recommend you listen to this episode first. Okay, let's head to trial. Welcome back to the Morel Dilemma. Here is where we are. In the last episode, we heard how investigators in Mount Siobhan hit a wall of negative tests while trying to figure out why so many people were developing ALS. They ended up using case control data to zero in on a never-before-seen toxicity linked to false morel mushrooms. And now, here we are in Bozeman, Montana, trying to do the same thing. We've ruled out a lot of toxins. We've even ruled out the false morel with DNA confirmation. But we're still trying to answer the question at the center of this outbreak. What made dozens of people sick and what killed people like Donna Ventura? And like Mount Siobhan, we now have case control data. And that data points hard at the morel, but this is where the parallel starts to break down. In Mount Siobhan, every person who developed ALS was eventually found to have eaten false morels. clean, consistent. That's not what we have here. Not everyone who got sick ate morels, and not everyone who ate morels got sick. And if I can't explain that, then the whole case against the morels starts to fall apart. So in this episode, we're putting a mushroom on trial, and I've called in an expert witness to help me do that. Together, we're going to pick apart the evidence accusing the morel to see if this theory breaks down or actually holds up. And as we do, well, we find out that it's not just morels getting a reputation for quietly developing a darker side. But for now, let's take a look at the evidence condemning the morel and see if it's really as concrete as we think. And to do that, I need to bring in someone very, very good at finding cracks.
My name is Grant Comstock. I am an emergency medicine physician at the Medical College of Wisconsin and am a medical toxicologist in the Division of Medical Toxicology, and I'm the Associate Medical Director for the Wisconsin Poison Center, and am delighted to be here today.
Dr. Grant Comstock, one of the sharpest toxicologists I think I've ever met. I wanted you here because you're incredible at pointing out limitations in data, but more importantly, I wanted you here for a very special reason.
Do you want to introduce that case that we had?
I mean, it feels like we have to.
The timing is pretty exceptional.
Right? So while I was recording and investigating this series on whether morel mushrooms might actually be severely poisonous, I still have to do my regular day job, and our toxicology team was consulted to help manage what very well may have been some cases of severe morel mushroom poisoning. People who had eaten morels and developed very severe GI toxicity. But during that time, we had a debate as to whether this was morel toxicity or just food poisoning. And I think you landed in the it's food poisoning camp, correct?
I did, and I mean, I'll be candid. I went into that case not knowing that this was an entity that people were considering, so shame on me for being unaware. And the dots connected for it to be something else.
The dots definitely lined up more with it just being food poisoning from a bacterial cause.
Right.
So even though I was so excited that it could be a morel, in that case, it was food poisoning.
However, I was unaware of the idea that the morels may actually be central to the disease state. I think I'm skeptical, but I'm also ready to be convinced, Ryan, and I'm considering myself a lump of clay right now. So, we'll see how this all shapes out.
And with that, we've both read the CDC MMWR report about the Bozeman outbreak. And this is the data we're going to put on trial because this is the evidence accusing the mushroom of being poisonous. And the prosecution has laid out quite a case. They don't have a smoking gun. They never found a toxin inside the morel or any other toxins sitting on it. But they do have a lot of witnesses and victims that they've interviewed, and they've built their case on a few key facts.
Patrons who got sick were more than 10 times more likely to have eaten any morel mushrooms at the restaurant.
Were there any other foods that you picked up an association on?
So really nothing else stood out as clearly as the morel mushrooms. Now, the amount of the various foods consumed was also important for us to establish whether there might be a dose-response relationship. When you model the amount of the special sushi roll consumed as a continuous variable, we saw a positive association between a one-piece increase in consumption and case status in all the models that we ran.
Meaning that the more pieces of the special sushi roll that someone ate, the more likely they were to develop illness.
So they show a strong association between morels and illness and a clear dose-response relationship, which as a toxicologist, I love. Do you agree with those findings?
I think that's fair. There are limitations, especially thinking about recall bias, but there is certainly a signal, a consistent pattern of symptoms, this dose-response relationship. It is the dose that makes the poison. Those are hard things to ignore.
So I think we can establish those are the wins that they have. But there are still 3 big problems to explain here. Not everyone who ate morels got sick. Not everyone who got sick ate morels. And I think very importantly, if morels are the cause, why have they just killed people for the first time after 2,000 years of being poisonous?
Right. A few holes.
So let's start with the first one. 5 of the 41 patients who got sick did not eat morels.
Right. That's an important hurdle, I think, in making this come together. It leaves the possibility out there that there's something else in the food, something else that wasn't detected. It unifies all of these cases, and we just didn't see it.
So I was concerned about this, but Heather and Dr. Ye actually have a pretty good explanation for this. And it's something that I've actually seen happen in other outbreaks too.
Of course, we did have some people who had some GI symptoms who did not eat the morel mushrooms.
Typically, when we are able to identify a clear pathogen, we can really zero in on our case definition and say, if we know it's this pathogen, they would have developed symptoms within this time frame, and that we can limit that case definition a bit. But in this instance, we really weren't able to do that because we didn't have a clear pathogen. We didn't have a clear, picture of how these symptoms presented, because they did present really differently in a lot of people.
Our medical toxicology team reviewed the medical records from the hospitalized patients to gather together that clinical picture of signs and symptoms that people were reporting, and to also help guide case definition. So for this investigation, a case was defined as the occurrence of diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, or abdominal pain in a person anytime after eating at this restaurant.
And so that kind of was why we had these additional reports of illness where individuals didn't eat morels.
So listening to that, they didn't really, at that point, know what morel poisoning looked like. So they had to include anyone who might have been a case.
Yeah, if you look at the symptom onset too, there's some fishy things. Some cases develop symptoms 92 hours later. That's like 4 days, which doesn't really fit the rapid onset GI symptoms that have typically been described with morel toxicity. So because there was this gap between the exposure and when patients were surveyed, there was a lot of time for people to develop nausea and vomiting for other reasons. It's very possible that some of the cases reflect background illness that was unintentionally attributed to the morel, like someone ate at the restaurant and then 2 days later their kid brought home some kind of stomach bug, and suddenly that gets counted as part of the outbreak. You buy that?
Yeah, I buy that. Without knowing what the syndrome is going to look like, you're going to have to overcall and over-include cases. And if I think about it, this has precedent as well. Didn't this also occur with the Uvalde outbreak?
That absolutely did occur. This is something we saw there. Early on in Uvalde, nobody knew what the toxin was or what the syndrome looked like. We just knew kids were getting very ill from vapes. We didn't know how sick they could get or what it could look like. So the CDC cast a really wide net and basically said, if you had lung symptoms and had vaped in the last 90 days, you were a case. And that pulled in a lot of background illness, viral infections, or other stuff that had nothing to do with vaping. And that's why we saw Uvalde in people using all different kinds of vapes, even though the poison was ultimately only found in THC vapes. So I think that's what's happening here too. Some of these cases were background illness captured under that broad definition. It's the trade-off when you don't want to miss the real signal in a novel outbreak.
Yeah, that makes sense. A reasonable enough explanation.
But that leaves our other problem. If morels are poisonous, why didn't everyone who ate them get sick? There were 10 people who ate morels and did totally fine. What is going on with these 10 people that they can have a sushi roll and not have any issues, but other people died? This is a big inconsistency that I think points away from the morel.
It is, but it's not the part that I have the biggest issue with. I think there are a couple of explanations that could be fairly believable. And the first is thinking of dose. We are exposed to toxins all the time, and the adage in toxicology is the dose makes the poison. So the ones who ate more of these sushi rolls are the ones who got sicker and vice versa. So that part, I think, there's plausibility. And the other possibility, and probably the crux of these findings, is that there is a difference in how these morels were prepared between those who got sick and those who did not.
Yeah, I think this is one of the most important findings of this study, and I'm actually going to let Dr. Ye take us through it.
The mushrooms, they decided to marinate them in a mixture of sweetened soy sauce, it was like soy sauce and rice wine mirin and vinegar and whatever else, and spices like ginger. But on the first day, they boiled that whole marinade mixture, and then they pour the hot marinade onto the mushrooms and just let them sit. So you can argue that they were maybe partially cooked. So people got sick, people got GI symptoms, but not very severe illnesses that day. The second day, when they served the mushrooms, they did not bother to boil the marinade. They just mixed the marinade ingredients together and just soaked the mushrooms in that. So that second batch was completely uncooked. So that's why we think the people who ate on the second day got a lot more sick. And there were more people who got sick because there was no heat applied at all.
So when we compared those two dates, we found that consumption of the special roll with morels was strongly associated with gastrointestinal illness on the day when the morels were served completely raw, compared to the day when they were served at least partially cooked.
They were raw morels. I mean, it's sushi. I probably should have seen that coming. But once you see that, this data starts to make a lot more sense because it's not one exposure anymore. It's two different scenarios. One with people eating cooked morels and one with them eating raw morels. You sold?
I'm sold. This part for me doesn't need a lot of convincing. We know that cooking food makes food safer from bacteria. And if this was a toxin, and still saying if, there are examples of other mushrooms like false morels where the toxin is heat labile. And so cooking those changes the risk as well. So I think all of that does come together in a reasonable way.
All right. That helps explain a lot. But there is still a mystery here because raw morels making people sick is not new. We've known about that for a long time, and people have been eating morels for centuries, raw, undercooked, mishandled, all of it. And yet we don't have any deaths like this. If nothing has changed about the toxicity of the morel, you'd expect to have seen this before. So that leaves us with one final question we have to answer. Why now are these suddenly not just making people sick, but killing people?
Yeah, this remains the biggest sticking point for me. And I raise an eyebrow these morel cases when we first brought them up. We've had these around for thousands of years, been eating them for thousands of years, and all of a sudden these are potentially a lethal ingestion. That is hard to wrap my mind around.
Yeah. So I have been sitting on this for a while, and I think there are a couple of explanations. But before we go any further, there's one that we probably actually should have addressed earlier. Everyone I've talked to so far has been in medicine or public health, not exactly in the mushroom world. So I feel like I had to ask the question, what if it actually is well known, just not to us? Here's Dr. Ye.
You're right. I don't think I learned about morels causing problems in fellowship, and we just think of morels as being edible. And that's probably why all these people on these multi-state calls kept asking, well, are you sure these are not false morels? Because we probably all read the same textbooks and have the same mindset.
That's fair. Like I said, I was not aware of this as a thing when I first encountered it. So maybe it's not new at all. Maybe it's just something that we in our medical community has never really appreciated.
If that's true, then I think the people who would know about morels being, I guess, fatally poisonous would be the mushroom diehards, right?
Reasonable.
So to test this hypothesis, I reached out to the most mushroom diehard person I know.
Is this Brooke Reed, our mushroom ID guy for the Poison Center?
That's correct. Brooke Reed. And here is what he had to say.
My name is Brooke Reed, and I currently serve as the Chief Operating Officer of NAMA, which is North American Mycological Association. The mission is promoting, pursuing, and advancing mycology, and specifically with regard to amateur mycology. And we are very proud amateur mycologists. And that word amateur can have a connotation of dilettante or uninformed, and that is not the case in mycology. Gary Linkoff, who wrote the Audubon Guide to North American Mushrooms, he would proudly declare himself an amateur, and he would tell you that an amateur is one who loves what they pursue. That really accurately describes the passion of our members within NAMA and within the clubs, the vast network of over 100 mycological clubs in Canada and the United States and Mexico. Everybody has the most wonderful acronyms. I just gave a lecture to SCUMS, South Carolina Upstate Mycological Society, SCUMS.
Oh,
I love them. And a wonderful mycological society. Falafel, the Florida Academic Lichen and I cannot remember. I'm sorry. Missouri Mycological Society, MOMS, is one of the jewels in the crown of NAMA affiliated clubs. Anyway, I'm getting off track.
You've certainly interacted with a lot of people who are mushroom curious. I'll put it that way.
It's true. And it starts with my family. Morels were a bit of a religion in my family. My uncle, my aunt, they had an old farmhouse, which they bought because as a young professor with no money, my uncle looked in the paper and he saw an ad for this farmhouse, and he drove out there and he drove all the way up this long lane, and he got out of the car and he heard a crunch under his feet, and there were morels everywhere, clumps of morels in the driveway, in the grass, everywhere. And the elderly farmer came out and he says, "Oh, you must be here about the house." And my uncle says, "Yeah, I am, but what's up with these mushrooms?" And the farmer says, "Oh, those damn things come up every year. I just hit them with the mower." And my uncle, "I'll take it." And the farmer said, "But you haven't been inside yet." He said, "I don't care. I am buying these mushrooms." And he did. He bought that house for those mushrooms, and they lived there for 60 some years. And we hunted morels every year.
So let's actually dive into this a little bit. One of the reasons I wanted to talk with you, not only do you know a lot of people in the mushroom community, you might have a better gauge of how prevalent this understanding is. But when I brought up the idea of this documentary to you, you told me a little anecdote of when you were younger in your morel loving family, you had a bit of an event happen. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. It's gross. I was 18 years old, and I was very young and strong and dumb. And I loved morels, and I loved hunting them. And I was at my Aunt Judy and Uncle Dick's place. It was in Bloomington, Illinois. We had picked morels early, and then we'd made dandelion wine. And I got hungry, and I thought, well, I'm 18. I can cook myself lunch. So I took 2 morels out of the refrigerator and washed them a little bit. And then I put them in a grilled cheese sandwich and cooked the grilled cheese sandwich. And that is not enough. That is not enough. And I ate 2 full raw morels, basically. And within about 2 hours, I began to vomit. And I vomited hard. And mind you, like, this is very unpleasant to talk about because I don't like it. And it was every 20 minutes to 30 minutes for 3 days, 72 full hours. It really was around the clock. I had to sleep sitting up, and it was bloody and it was painful. And I also had diarrhea. I was very ill. I was 18. I can't help but think I got very lucky, with my age, and maybe I cooked them just enough to, I don't know. I didn't eat a single mushroom of any kind for 10 years after that.
I can't imagine a force strong enough to keep you from eating a mushroom for 10 years.
But I think being 18 and strong, and I got lucky and it ran its course. But I don't tell that as a light anecdote. It really was awful. I was terribly ill, and I remember it with chagrin and shuddering to this day.
I'm wondering, this happened to you when you were 18. Did you know then that they had even the ability to be poisonous?
No, I didn't.
The mycology community is very large and contains experts that are pretty much unmatched, all the way to people who just recently watched a single Facebook reel about morels and decide, hey, I'm going to go out and grab them. Do you feel in this community that there is an awareness of the potential poisonous nature of morels? I mean, you educate on it. When you do, are people surprised to hear about it? Or do you think
I
this
am
is...
sorry to say they are. They are surprised. And I am surprised that they are surprised, but they are surprised. I gave the morel talk in Missouri at the event called Morel Madness, which is a wonderful event. They know what they're doing, but that event attracts a lot of people who are maybe only into morels or just getting into it. And when I started talking about morels killed people in 2023, and this was in 2025, people gasped. And when I started talking about my story about being poisoned, people were shocked. They were shocked. I gave morel talks 5 times through the Southeast. I'm not anybody special, but morels are. So very interested mushroom people pack those rooms. I go into morel toxicity and incidents, and I talk about the folks who passed away. And in every case, the general impression I had is that they were shocked when I got into the toxicology. And so when I get into it, people are gasping and people go, but they're morels. They're easy to identify. They're delicious. They're a traditional food. They are only available in a narrow band of season. So they're really a prize. And people think that they're only these jewels, only this delectable quarry, and not that they have a dark side.
Well, it seems Brooke knew about raw morel toxicity through some first-hand experience as long as a few decades ago. So maybe this was around. I mean, does hearing his story about how he ate a raw morel grilled cheese sandwich and was vomiting for 3 days give any extra credence to the hypothesis here?
I suppose so. I imagine Brooke Reed is a guy who knows how to appropriately identify a morel. So it's not a misidentification, I would assume, and that's a pretty gory story. So sure, it cements it a little bit in my mind.
Right. In the medical community, none of us would be surprised to hear raw food caused a GI illness. We would just assume it's bacterial. I don't think we ever considered, though, that the morel could have been central to the actual effect, something in the morel.
Yeah. And right, maybe that's the reason we think it's new, and maybe that's why it's not in the literature. We never had a reason to study this in the past. If it looks like food poisoning, that does not make for a terribly interesting case report, so nobody's going to study it like it's something new.
Yeah. You need a signal strong enough to make you question your assumptions. And maybe this outbreak was the first time that happened. But he didn't know several decades ago about their potentially poisonous nature. And what people still don't know now, and what he goes around and talks about at mushroom conferences, were the deaths. And when he brings those up in rooms full of people, they are shocked. So this is not common knowledge in the mushroom community, people dying. It wasn't something that was happening in the past.
Right. It's not just our insular nature in medicine that has kept us away from this knowledge. It makes me feel a little bit better that we didn't know about this either. So the question then is, what is changed? Why are these morels all of a sudden killing people after thousands of years? And is it just a question of more exposure? More people are eating them, and so now we're seeing these rare and severe cases.
I think that's one possibility. In fact, the CDC report says the 2 patients who died had chronic underlying medical conditions that might have affected their ability to tolerate the massive fluid losses. And mushrooms are definitely having a moment. It seems like more people are eating them now than ever. So if more people are eating them, you're naturally going to see more of these edge cases where a morel encounters a particularly vulnerable patient. Then what's usually a self-limited illness becomes life-threatening.
Sure.
But it still doesn't fully add up, because this cannot be the first time morels have encountered vulnerable patients. Brooke actually told me something interesting about the average age of these mycological communities.
The average age of NAMA members, it's gone down in recent years as we do more outreach, but it's high. It's always had a lot of retirees involved, or at least during my time.
So I just venture that many vulnerable people in the past have encountered a raw morel.
Fair.
And that's why I think there's another more interesting and plausible explanation for how morels may have developed a new, more severe toxicity. And it turns out there are other examples of mushrooms developing brand new toxicities. Hey everybody, Ryan with a quick interruption. This series only exists because of listeners like you. There are no sponsors, institutions, or billionaires quietly bankrolling this in the background. Just a lot of time, research, and production to bring these stories to life. And there are real costs that come with that. Editing software, sound design, website hosting, podcast hosting, advertising to get the word out, and a lot more. So if you're finding value in it, there are a few ways you can support the show. The first is to go to thepoisonlab.com/support and become a supporting member for as little as $1 a month. And for that, you are going to get access to every single episode ad-free and access to amazing bonus content. You get access to all of that by becoming a supporting member. But if you want to support the show and get something a little more tangible in return, there are 2 educational projects I've built alongside this series you should check out. The first is Poisonous Fungus Among Us. This is a short, simple, rhyming book about mushroom foraging safety. It's built for kids, families, curious foragers. It's a 7-minute read. It uses real, beautiful photographs of poisonous mushrooms and delivers scientifically accurate information in a way that rhymes. You can find it on Amazon by searching Poisonous Fungus Among Us, and it's also free on Kindle Unlimited. The second project is called Gotta Pick 'em. It is a poisonous mushroom card game designed by toxicologists who treat mushroom poisoning. It's a simple, fast-paced card game, but underneath it, you're learning how different mushroom poisons work, what organs they impact, the basics about their anatomy, antidotes we use for them, and you actually don't need to know anything about mushrooms to play. You can find out way more about it at gottapickem.com, which is the companion blog that will teach you not only how to play, but a lot more about poisonous mushrooms. So, if you want to support independent public health storytelling like this, you can find links to all of those options in the show notes. But you don't have to pay anything to support the show. Just being here or sharing this with someone who might learn from it goes a long way. So thank you for listening. Let's get back to the show. Have you ever heard of wood lovers paralysis?
Shockingly, Ryan, I have not heard of wood lovers paralysis, but please do enlighten me.
Neither had I until very recently. But I came across a researcher named Dr. Simon Beck, who's been studying exactly this phenomenon associated with some very specific mushrooms. And before we get into it, let's just have him describe it.
Wood lovers paralysis is this fascinating toxidrome that occurs sometimes after the ingestion of certain species of psilocybin mushrooms. And the reason it's called wood lover paralysis is that the species of psilocybin mushrooms that have been associated with it are all lignicolous species, meaning that they grow on decaying wood. Typically, the legs and the hands were the most commonly affected first, and other people described essentially weakness affecting any part of their body. A lot of people report the main thing that seemed to make the weakness worse was use of the particular muscles. So it was a fatigable weakness, and that was described in some really interesting ways. It feels like you have a dodgy battery, got enough charge to take a few steps, battery runs out and you kind of fall down because your legs don't work anymore. But if you rest for a little while, the battery kind of rebuilds a little bit of charge and you can get back up and you can walk another few steps and then you'll fall down again. And that was really common.
Can I just say that I hope that the term dodgy battery exists somewhere in the title for this publication?
Unfortunately, that is an exclusive with our interview, or maybe fortunately. That was Dr. Beck describing what sounds like a pretty profound syndrome of weakness after eating certain species of psilocybin mushrooms. But what's important here, I think, is this is new. This is new to me. This is new to you.
Yes, this is new to me.
And this was new to Dr. Beck as well. Let's take a listen to how he even heard about this?
Started hearing about this through sort of harm reduction work in Australia with all of the renewed interest in its potential health benefits. We've seen a massive increase in the use of psilocybin mushrooms. So more people were taking them. We started hearing more about it. And I did a bit of searching and tried to see if this was a known thing. So obviously mushrooms have been used for a very long time. I sort of thought most of these things would have been well described. And all I could find really were some online reports on forums.
Does that sound familiar to you?
Yeah, I think I have a sense as to where all of this is going. It sounds a lot like our conversation with the morels, something that we would have imagined would have been clearly described and characterized by now if we had actually been recognizing it.
Yeah. And as Dr. Beck said, mushrooms have been used for a very long time. I thought most of these things would have been well described. And actually, if you want to go into the literature and find information about morels causing nausea and vomiting, you really won't. It's not in a lot of published medical literature. And the deaths certainly aren't until now. But actually, this wood lover's paralysis is better described than morel poisoning because Dr. Beck was at least able to find some prior case reports.
There were a couple of mentions in some medical literature, the earliest of which being in Japan in 1973, where there was 3 or 4 people who experienced some profound weakness after ingesting some psilocybin mushrooms, and then some cases in the early 90s from New Zealand. But there wasn't anything sort of formal exploring it, and particularly trying to come up with a good description over the nature of the symptoms.
So I guess before we start, are you sold that this is a thing? I guess that's the first question.
Maybe. I think it leads at least me to have some open-ended questions as I'm hearing this.
I mean, there are a few case reports out there that Dr. Beck found. And for what it's worth, he didn't come into this trying to prove anything. He was skeptical too until he saw a case of his own.
I saw it once at a festival where I was doing some harm reduction work, and someone came in with this fairly profound and very unusual paralysis, which got me really fascinated. And I mean, the very first time I saw it, I think obviously my thought was, is this a misidentification? Is this a toxic ingestion of some other species mushroom? But when I started seeing these reports online and from people who were quite experienced mushroom identifiers, and that had very similar experiences, and all of the reports were quite similar in terms of the symptoms being reported from people who really are quite good at identifying these mushrooms, you start to think, all right, this seems less and less like ingestion of a misidentified mushroom, and more likely that this is a bizarre potential occurrence with these psilocybins.
So Dr. Beck saw firsthand what his patients and internet forums were telling him.
I like it. That is interesting.
Yeah, and he wasn't the only one seeing this phenomenon in recent years.
My name is Dr. Yit Liang. I am an emergency physician and clinical toxicologist currently practicing in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. For many years, wood lover paralysis was not regarded as a genuine neurological entity. It was largely considered a subjective sensation or weakness occurring during the psychedelic experience rather than an objective neurological deficit. But this perception changed in early 2025 following our management of 2 patients who presented to our emergency department with clear and demonstrable neuromuscular weakness consistent with the description reported within the psychedelic community. And these weren't subtle symptoms. One of these patients had rather profound weakness, which was sufficiently striking that I recorded the neurological examination. It was just fascinating.
That's Dr. Liang, and he is one of the authors of a case series of several patients who developed wood lover's paralysis.
Oh, really?
The first one, she had prepared a tea by boiling approximately 15 mushrooms in a pot. And several hours after the onset of her psychedelic effects, she developed rapidly progressive weakness. This evolved from difficulty walking to significant respiratory compromise and inability to lift her head. Fortunately, she was discovered in time by a housemate and was sent to hospital pretty promptly. On arrival at the hospital, there had been partial improvement in her proximal upper limb strength. However, she continued to demonstrate marked lower limb weakness and was unable to lift her legs against gravity. On arrival, it was one of my colleagues who saw her first, and they activated the stroke call. She had a full CT brain, CT angiogram, and the perfusion, and everything was normal. And that was when my colleague came to me and said, "Hey, what do you reckon?" That's how it came by. And then the second case was just not long after that, because it always happens around this time. In fact, around April to July. The second case presented with an even more dramatic clinical course. He had developed weakness several hours after ingesting 8 raw psilocybe mushrooms. And same thing, he did have the psychedelic effect. A couple hours after that, he started to get pretty weak. This patient collapsed while speaking with emergency service on the phone. And upon a paramedic arrival, he was found to be apneic, bradycardic, and cyanotic, needing immediate intubation at the scene prior to transfer to hospital.
Oh man, I think that's compelling.
Right? So we can find signals of this syndrome as early as the 1970s, but we didn't hear anything about it until 2025. And either we are recognizing it more now or it's happening more for some reason, but the syndrome can be pretty severe. Intubation was reported in that case series.
Yeah. It's a lot to chew off.
So then we have to ask the question, what is new about these mushrooms? We've known for a long time that psilocybin has effects on people, but not this kind of effect.
For sure.
And in fact, the data doesn't really support that the psilocybin is involved. It might be something else new in the mushroom.
One of the things that we tried to consider really carefully when we were designing this is that, the psilocybin experience often comes with a degree of body load, or what's called body load. And that, can feel like a sort of heaviness for people. The interesting thing, a majority of cases came on within the first 2 to 4 hours of ingestion. I think that was represented somewhere around 3/4. But quite a significant proportion of people reported that they didn't notice the weakness until after the psychedelic effects had worn off the next day, which is really useful information for saying this is not psilocybin, most likely. Because I think if it were psilocybin or if it were a psychosomatic thing, you would expect it to be happening around the peak effect of psilocybin, which is closer to 1 to 2 hours in, and you would certainly expect it to abate as the psilocybin level diminished, which is one of the reasons we don't think this is psilocybin.
So in Dr. Beck's study, they were finding weakness that happened after the psychedelic effects wore off.
Right. That's important.
Yeah. And Dr. Leong's case series also showed that.
Those that we have seen in our facility, they are not affected in any way. They're actually just any other patient that you see that they didn't mention anything about the mushroom. You wouldn't even know. And we've seen a few cases of these paralysis happens even with just a minuscule dose.
So the timing alone makes it hard to blame psilocybin.
Reasonable.
If that were the culprit, you'd expect the weakness to track when the psychedelic effects were peaking. But the data shows it showing up after those effects are fading or already gone.
Yeah, that is odd.
And there's another reason why I really think this supports there being something else now in these mushrooms. If it was just psilocybin, you'd expect to see this with everyone taking psilocybin mushrooms everywhere, which is a lot of people nowadays. And this is actually only being reported with very specific mushrooms. Take a listen. You found that 96% were linked to these wood-loving species.
Yeah, aside from the case in Japan, which was psilocybe subcerulipes, all of the other reports have been from a very closely related group in the genus psilocybe, which until fairly recently has been called psilocybe section cyanescens. I think there's some debate between the Australian and the American mycologists at the moment about whether to rename this subsection subaeruginosae, but I don't want to step on too many toes with that. I'm not a mycologist, so I'm not all across that. A few different species. Common denominator is that they all grow from wood, and most of them are very, very closely related. What we need is not just an explanation for why this happens, but why this only happens with some specimens of this species, because the majority of the time when people go and pick subaeruginosa, cyanescens, azuracens, any of these, they don't get this weakness. However, what we found as well in our survey is that one patch of this mushroom that has caused this syndrome is more likely to cause it again even in future years. And we know that these are perennial mushrooms. They're persistent. They don't die off every season and regrow from new spores. The mycelium actually stays in that patch. and that a single patch is often one genetic organism. Sometimes there can be several genetic organisms in there of the same species, but broadly they are a single genetic organism that will persist across years. So we thought further evidence for the fact that this is likely to be a function of the genetic variance of these species is that one local population seems to be more prone to causing it even in subsequent years than other populations. What it is that these mushrooms are producing as a result of that genetic variance that causes this, we don't know.
I think that leads us to a really interesting idea. Not all mushrooms of the same species even behave the same way. There may be local variation, genetic drift that changes the bioactive molecules they can produce.
Yeah, that reproducibility from one specific cluster, that specificity, I do think I agreed adds a compelling component.
And it gets a lot more interesting because there is actually a very plausible biochemical mechanism here, unlike the morel. One of the metabolites related to psilocybin, called 4-hydroxytrimethyltryptamine, produced by these mushrooms, is nearly identical in structure to another compound that is known to cause paralysis or neuromuscular blockade. That molecule is called bufotenidine. They're actually isomers, meaning they have the exact same chemical formula, just one molecule is moved. And even small genetic changes in these species of mushrooms can dramatically increase how much of this possibly paralytic compound, 4-hydroxytrimethyltryptamine, gets produced.
To that point, in a yeast model of psilocybin biosynthesis, when they added an extra copy of the Psy-M gene, which produces the enzyme that's responsible for that methylation step, they actually ended up with a 20-fold increase in the production of 4-hydroxytrimethyltryptamine. Wow. So one extra copy of that gene responsible for the methylation massively increased the production of this potential neuromuscular junction blocking agent, which I think added extra weight to the idea that we know that these genes vary quite a lot in these wild populations. And here's some experimental evidence that a very small change to that genetic machinery can yield a very, very large change in the chemical expression that might explain why some local populations cause this and other local populations do not.
So now you got a scenario where two populations of the same species could be producing something very different. It's not actually that hard to imagine that we're not dealing with the same mushrooms that we were decades ago.
So agreed. I think at least this establishes a precedent that there's something that we assume behaves in one way for a long time. Under the right circumstances and conditions, it starts to behave a different way. And even moving beyond genetic drift, there are other examples in toxicology where the environment is paramount in determining toxicity. Example that comes to mind is thinking about the blue-ringed octopus, where in captivity, without exposure to local bacteria, it does not contain a life-threatening neurotoxin, but in its natural wild environment contains a poison called atrodotoxin, which is a very potent paralytic that is known to cause significant symptoms and mortality. And so the environment very much informs its toxicity as well.
Yeah, I love that. Poison dart frogs, too. They're toxic in the wild, but not in captivity. When you change the environment, you can change the expression of toxins in a number of organisms. And with changes in climate and cultivation and ecosystems, it wouldn't surprise me if these mushrooms were either absorbing something new or even developing new bacterial relationships that might predispose them to some poisoning we've never heard of.
Yeah, for sure. And the way we source and handle food now, it's totally different than it was in past decades. And so between like environmental changes, cultivation, genetic variation, it is not implausible that something like this could be different today.
So is that what's happening here? We have a new morel?
It's a compelling idea. I can still come up with more straightforward explanations in my mind. I know that did a really extensive job ruling out typical foodborne causes of illness, but was that fully exhaustive? Is it possible that there was something missed? A different or new foodborne pathogen that maybe is actually just as likely as the morel causing the toxicity. But I guess at the same time, if it is the morel, if it is morel toxicity, would look like foodborne illness. And so maybe that's why it has gone unrecognized for so long.
Yeah.
I'm more of a believer now. Certainly these folks have taken a harder look than I would know how to. And so it's at some point maybe the right thing to take them at their word, because clearly they thought about it hard. And I think I plan to cook my next morel until it is an unrecognizable piece of coal.
We don't have a toxin we could point to, but we do have a consistent set of symptoms, a tight exposure window, a clear dose-response relationship, and an investigation that ruled out every usual suspect. And the only signal that's left keeps pointing over and over at the morel mushroom. This is kind of the beauty of these scientific explorations. No matter what your preconceived notions are, like morel mushrooms are a delicacy that don't kill people. Objectively following the data can force you to re-examine what you think you know.
That sounds very thorough, for sure.
After hearing about Heather, Rachel, and Dr. Ye's investigation, even Dr. Bassett and Jaworski, who, like myself, were initially skeptical, seem to agree.
They did a very, very more thorough than many could do, and as best as you could adjudicate it, it sounds like they did. You know, this comes up a lot of times with drug testing. When we get a drug test that comes back negative, the novice interpreter would say, couldn't have been drugs because nothing showed up positive. Right. And, you know, you can sort of see where I'm going with this. You know, there's a lot of false negatives. Is this some morel-driven toxin that might not be stable? Do we even have the testing methods or standards to identify that? It takes time to develop a reference standard to be able to identify these things, and that's always a possibility.
At a certain point, when there are no other explanations, you just have to take it for what it is. While I'm still a bit baffled as to how this is happening, maybe that's not the most important thing right now. What matters is that we have clear documented evidence. Morel mushrooms, when served raw or undercooked, can cause serious illness. And for the first time, that's been formally published in the scientific literature as part of a mass poisoning outbreak. And while this outbreak may have been the loudest signal, it turns out it wasn't the first.
We just think of morels as being edible, but there have been many reports of acute illnesses occurring after consumption of morel mushrooms over the years.
And it's not even the last.
Our study to see about a possible new toxicity of morel was prompted by one case we had at the Paris Poison Center with one man who developed severe shock after the ingestion of morel.
The CDC report was just the nudge we needed to go finding the signals that have been hiding under the surface. And in the next episode, we'll hear exactly how many other deaths we've been missing. That's next time on A Morel Dilemma. If you are finding anything in this series valuable, the best way to support the show is simple. Leave a rating, write a review, and share it with someone who should hear it. This project is completely independent. No funding, no sponsors, no institutions. Just an effort to help people understand how poisoning outbreaks are identified, investigated, and hopefully prevented. If you'd like to support the show more directly, there are 3 things you can do. Head to thepoisonlab.com/support to get access to all episodes early and ad-free, or check out our educational projects like Poisonous Fungus Among Us and the Gotta Pick'em card game. Links are in the show notes. Either way, thanks for being here and for helping share this story. Because this won't be the last outbreak, but maybe together we can recognize the next one sooner. This show is written and produced by me, Ryan Feldman. Music is from Pixabay, featuring artists Vera Miller, Driver Silver, Lexan Music, and Rocco Garibaldi. Audio production and sound design by Max McClellan, MKM Audio. This show is a production of Clinical Toxicology, LLC.
6 people are now dead.
Investigators are focused on a spice that should never have been in food.
State health officials are now working with federal agencies to